Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1350. Yes, we are at the mid-century once more. It's amazing that it doesn't feel to be such a long time ago since we reached the 1000. And now we are 1/3 into the next millennia. I wonder when we will catch up with the year 2023. I will try to put in some comments and quotes here, both from Terrence Deacon, but I will start with another thing entirely and take the quotes during the lecture. And this book came to my eye, Henry Kamen, The Disinherited. And it's about the exiles who created Spanish culture. This is a good example of where there are no borders. There are no physical border. These are the people because of Spain's reputed tendency for strictness, hostility, violence and intolerance has expelled several groups. We're speaking about the Moors, the Mozarabs, the Jews, Protestants, intellectuals and so on. These people formed a very important Spain, but outside its border. It seemed that something continued the Spanishness also in these people. And one example I have from my own experience was a couple of years ago when I discovered that in the second biggest town of Greece, Thessaloniki, there were Spanish-speaking Jews that went all the way back to their expulsion in the late 15th century. I think the determinate year there was 1492, but it continued for a long time. They ended up in the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't go bankrupt or disappeared. Some factor, whether it was autogenesis or the telos, kept them going, and their Spanish is still 500 years almost understandable to almost every word. You can also hear the intonation. And that, I think, it's an example of things that continue by themselves outside the safe boundaries of the, let's say, mechanistic Spanish culture, with its tradition upheld by physicality within the borders of Spain, and of course with a stately government, army, police, neighborhood, houses, food, manners of being, I would say also climate, situatedness and all those things. It is also a very good read to be recommended, although it's a bit massive. A whopping 500 pages almost. I will now continue my read of the article Steps to Metaphysics of Incompleteness. And I would say it's a very good introductory text to what is more complicated and dense. For instance, his seminal book, Incomplete Nature, and the earlier book, Symbolic Species. And we will try to dwell to these books as time passes. I will start with a quote I decided just now from Incomplete Nature. It's on page 116. It starts actually already with a quote of Van Orman Quine. The great American philosopher Van Quine, in a conversation I had with him about a year before his death, told me that he considered Darwin's greatest philosophical achievement to consist in having refuted Aristotle's final cause. At the present, we still recognize 4 teleological phenomena or processes in nature. But they can all be explained by the laws of chemistry and physics. Fire in the mountain. While a cosmic teleology, such as that adopted by Kant, does not exist. Unquote. Whether or not we can credit Darwin with such a monumental philosophical achievement, this assertion nonetheless captures the belief held by most biologists that even the action of organisms can be understood as thoroughly mechanistic. And on par with the other physical processes of the inorganic world, except for being incorporated into a living body. But recognizing that organisms behave in ways that differ from inorganic processes. Meyer sought a terminological distinction that would exemplify a middle ground between mere mechanism and purpose. He turned to a term coined by Colin Pittendry in a paper 1958, teleonomy. The Greek combining form nomi merely implies law-like behavior. and so one could use it to describe behavior that was asymmetrically oriented toward a particular target state. Even in systems where there was no explicit representation of that state. But only a regular, predictable orientation toward an end state. By only specifying the way a mechanical process can be organized so that it converges toward a specific state, rather than behavior for the sake of an end. This conception avoided sneaking mentalistic assumptions about teleology back into biological discourse. Meyer agrees with Pittendry that this makes it possible to feel no discomfort in saying that a turtle came ashore to lay her eggs. Instead of just, she came ashore and laid her eggs. According to Meyer, there is now complete consensus among biologists that the teleological phrasing of such a statement does not imply any conflict with physico-chemical causality. By coining a term which implied target directedness, but was agnostic about how this behavior was produced or came to exist, biologists and engineers could continue to use teleologically loaded descriptions, but without the metaphysical baggage that tended to come with them. to the extent that the process of natural selection could be conceived as consequence blind. And accident driven. This target-directed tendency could also be treated as accidental. It seemed as though teleology had been fully reduced to mere mechanism. End of sight. This is, of course, incredibly interesting. Even the good Sir David Attenborough would use in depiction on the movie a turtle swimming to the shore in order to lay eggs. And we must remember biologists are possibly the most stern enemies of any sort of teleology. And still, every nature program on television shows obvious telos. Otherwise, I could imagine the programs would be unbearable. Just patches in no specific order. Maybe first you see the eggs, then you see the turtle swimming, and then all of a sudden small turtles start swimming around. I will now continue the text, and I will add some more quotes from the other book here, and also an imported quote from my dear colleague. In the case of the hole at the wheel's hub, the absence of material at this position is a necessary feature of what constitutes the wheel. Without reference to the material of the wheel, it is not a whole at all, just a region of space. The wheel must have this absence of material at its hub in order to be able to rotate with respect to a rigid axle. Only an absence of material between that of the axle and that of the wheel will allow this to occur. Excuse me. Of course, the material components of the wheel are in no way dispensable to the use. Without them, there is no wheel. But neither can one dispense with the place at the center where there is no material. Otherwise, the whole wheel is useless. This intrinsic functional relationality is made explicit in the final line of the Taoist verse from which this concept is drawn. It says in Deacon's interpretation, though we can only work with what is there, use comes from what is not there. It is use that we are focused on here, not merely the stuff or its absence. And I will comment here and say this is pretty close to 200 and 400, close enough to be used for understanding. This is linked to another potential misunderstanding of the concept of absence. Mistakenly treating absence as non-being might lead one to ask, how can the absence of something be physically extended in space and time? Again, consider the wheel. The wood of the rim, spokes and hub is extended in space and time, and the whole has a precise locus and extent in relation to them. Where the hub is, there in the center is the empty space. Thus, its extension, its spatiotemporal existence, that is, its size in a particular location, is unambiguously and quite precisely determined by this relational existence. Though the whole is defined negatively, it nonetheless can be said to exist in this relational sense. The whole is an actuality, not a mere possibility. In this respect, it cannot be accurately characterized in modal terms. It is not merely the possibility of material being located there. The movement of the cart utterly depends on the whole actually being there. Without the absence of material at this location, rotation of the wheel would not be possible. So, just as the roundness of the wheel's material structure is critical for the rolling of the wheel. The whole as at its center is equally critical for the functional, non-sticking connection between the cart's axle and the wheel. The efficacy confusion is also related to this misidentification of absence with non-being. Defining the concept of constraint in terms of absent degrees of freedom makes it tempting to think of absences doing things. But absences themselves do not work. Nor do they resist work. And yet, there is no work without absence. The absent degrees of freedom are only part of the story, necessary but not sufficient. Physical work requires the release of energy in a constrained context. Thus, the exploding gases in an engine cylinder are constrained to expand only in one direction and thereby move a piston in the one degree of freedom that is least resistant to the force of the explosion. These constraints can thereby enable a process of entropy increase to drive another process toward a lower entropy state, such as moving a car uphill. Constraints do not work. They enable and channel the outcome of energy release. This has led several writers, Guerrero, Emeche, Köppe and Stjernfeldt, also to reinterpret Aristotle's notion of formal cause in terms of constraint. The point is that physical work requires both a formal and an energetic aspect. Without either, no work can be done. And change merely proceeds in what Deacon calls an orthograde direction. Constraints are intrinsically relational phenomena. They are reflected in relationships between degrees of freedom that are excluded and those that are not excluded. And these are always degrees of freedom of some physical process of change. So when we argue that the constraints that characterize autogenesis actively preserve themselves, we are not mentioning the fact that this active preservation necessarily involves physical processes that by virtue of these constraints do the work of preventing these same constraints from degrading. And because these constraints are preserved, this renewed energetic gradient is again channeled into autogenic catalysis and linked self-assembly processes. The chemical reactions that are thereby prevented are those that would degrade this capacity to prevent potentially degrading reactions. I will just start in section 3 and then add a quote. Section 3, to be and not to be. And this is not to gloat at anything, I made that mistake myself. But confusing non-being with absence is disastrous. But we are all in good company. Schopenhauer did it. So did Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus and many others. Why Parmenides did the same thing. There is actually, oddly enough, no connection between non-being and absence, as clearly put to the paper by Deacon here. Let's continue with the Shakespearean section number 3, to be and not to be. It is our contention that this analysis may finally provide a partial answer to Descartes' dilemma. How can an extensionless mode of being affect the causality of extended beings? And I will translate that myself into Chalmers' hard problem as well. It fits. The great success of molecular biology over the past half-century has been achieved by a methodology that is effectively a marriage of chemistry and engineering logic, and a strict prohibition on the use of teleological concepts for explanatory purposes. Yet, although physics and chemistry have no place for teleological concepts, the same cannot be said about engineering. The devices that engineers produced are designed. They are constructed to perform a particular functions, to achieve human aims, and I would say, in front of all, the hand. A machine does not benefit from its functioning. People do. I will take another quote from the book, The Symbolic Species, the Co-Evolution of Language and the Brain. Do note, now I am jumping into the discourse of Deacon, but I see a parallel here that is too interesting not to take up already at this, well, let's call it beginner state. It's from page 69. The assumption that one-to-one mapping of words to objects and vice versa is the basis for meaning and reference was made explicit in the work of the turn of the century French linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. In his widely influential work on semiology, he argued that word meaning can be modeled by an element by element mapping between two planes of objects, from elements constituting the plane of signifiers, that is, words. Two elements on the plane of the signified, the ideas, objects, events that words refer to. On this view, the mapping of a vervet monkey alarm calls onto predators could be considered a signifier-signified relationship. But how accurately does this model word reference? Although it is natural to imagine words as labels for objects or mental images or concepts, we can now see that such correspondences only capture superficial aspects of word meaning. Focusing on correspondence alone collapses a multi-leveled relationship into a simple mapping relationship. It fails to distinguish between the root understanding of words that my dog possesses and the semantic understanding of them that a normal human speaker exhibits. We also saw that the correspondence of words to reference is not enough to explain word meaning. Because the actual frequency of correlations between items on the two planes is extremely low. Instead, what I hope to show is that the relationship is the reverse of what we commonly imagine. The correspondence between words and objects is a secondary relationship, subordinate to a web of associative relationships of a quite different sort, which even allows us reference to impossible things. End of quote of the book. I do remember this keenly myself when coming upon Saussure in the early 90s. It felt like extremely superficial. By entering the lecture hall, it felt that we had to give up a large portion of our understanding of language. We had to leave depth, I would say even knowledge aside, to start with a mechanistic system. And of course, the reason for this mechanistic system, in my opinion, is one of the reasons is trying to avoid telos, telonomy, to make the subject of linguistic less telenomic. It's a subjective thing to do, it's based on emotions, and it asked us students to leave 99% of the world outside the lecture hall and allow a system that was mechanistic but contained much less knowledge than the knowledge we had when we entered. I wasn't too happy with this. You could feel through the whole lecture hall that we were giving knowledge up. We were oversimplifying, and we were making ourselves dumber, more dense and insensitive to the qualities of language. And other things as well. I do have to mention that one author who wasn't so much into the mechanistic, Steven Pinker, still to this day claims that singing is an unnecessary parasitic tendency on language. Another quote maybe? Yes, please, here.
I could actually...
Don't forget the camera. Oh, you are in the camera.
Yeah, I could actually spin on that, what you said about Saussure. You gave me an insight, Hans. How can we, let's think like the Saussure thought. So let's think about, for instance, let's imagine that this is the wheel. No, this is let's imagine this as a wheel. This is a wheel. Okay, so the Saussure thought that, okay, we put the word weed here, so this is a label, okay, so far. That's, so it's only, it's arbitrary. And so, how did the Saussure reason? I think he thought in, and I got this insight from Nisbet. He said that Westerners think in lines. So this is a line, so everything points to something else. While I think to understand language, we have to think like people in Asia think. For them, they think in circles. So I think that language is like is inside our wheel. Language is already embedded in the world. So the wheel is the world and word at the same time. Word and I think it's a good they are homonyms more or less in English, and so it's embedded already in the language. So we should think language as something around like a wheel, because we cannot think in straight lines. It becomes superficial. As to separate things, thinking like in a linearity, it becomes superficial. They're like pointers, labels. That was, I think, Saussures' mistake. And let's think about how would Plato think? Let's think the ideal wheel, like up there in the his realm of ideas. How would it look like? Okay, it could look like this, something like that. But then he has a problem. He has empty space, and that would give a lot of headache to Plato for the first. And then he doesn't think about use. A wheel without a road. What is the point? That would be like a work of art. Arbitrary, completely.
Yeah, work of art, yeah.
So I think that was my point.
Very good, Kalle, thank you. And as you said, Saussure also thought about the wheel as being of no use. For him, it doesn't have a telos either. And I think my idea is these tendencies are quite new to the world, because they came after the Industrial Revolution. And obviously it's not only the word that lacks use, it's oddly enough also the wheel for Saussure. He doesn't, for him it's just an object. It's truly for-handen. He just sits and looks at it, and there it is, and it does its job by itself. This is extremely funny because there hasn't been a constructor of any wheel who didn't have a telos. It's always present. Actually, if you are an engineer and you don't understand telos, I think you have to quit your job pretty soon. And that does actually happen these days. Another author, and I don't want to make it more complicated, but I still have to name drop him, Ian McGilchrist, has pointed out. I say thank you very much, it was a pure pleasure, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.